Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Scott Moore, and I'm the Assistant Chair of the History Department. And on behalf of the department, I would like to welcome all of you to today's event, and thank you for attending today's Flash Talk. These talks are an opportunity for members of the history faculty to offer important historical context and background regarding current events that are shaping global affairs. And this afternoon, our speaker is Dr. Carenen. Before I introduce Dr. Carenen, I'd like to speak briefly about the structure of today's Flash Talk and to help sort of set the sort of structure you can expect. We ask that everyone hold all questions until the end of the presentation. There's a lot to cover, and we want to make sure that that's able to be covered. We'll open the floor for questions toward the end. In order to ensure that we're able to get to as many questions as possible, we also ask that people try to be concise with their question and limit it to one per person. Also, as we've done in past events, we try to prioritize student questions over the questions from faculty and staff. And lastly, I think we're all aware that this is a volatile situation, and I would like to ask everybody to please remain respectful of each other and the topic during the talk and when asking questions. Eastern has a strong community built off of a spirit of consensus and mutual respect, and I know that that spirit's going to carry through today's talk. Now I have the privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Carenen. Dr. Carenen is a distinguished professor of history, and she also serves as our department chair. She is an expert in American foreign policy in the Middle East and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition to several articles, she is the author of 2 books on the topic. Her first, The Fervent Embrace, Liberal Protestants, Evangelicals, and Israel, was published in 2012. Her second, An Introductory History of the United States in the Middle East, was published in 2021. In addition to these publications, she has presented at national and international conferences. She has also held 2 fellowships focused on terrorism and Israeli studies. These include research trips to Israel and the West Bank, and she has lived in Jerusalem to conduct research. This past April, she has presented at the President's Panel on U.S. Foreign Policy at Nichols College, and she has held academic fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Brandeis University's Schusterman Institute for Israel Studies, and at the Jacob Rader Marcus Center for American Jewish Archives at Hebrew Union College. She was an academic fellow for terrorism studies with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Carenen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I appreciate that introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit about what my goal is today for this talk, and it is to offer a very, very brief, see brief italicized up there, history of the conflict to provide some context for what happened on October 7th and is continuing to happen in Gaza and Israel. And I just want to say I usually take a whole semester to teach this class, so doing it in 45 minutes, I think it's stressful to do it in a semester, so please forgive me. I know that I'm leaving important things out, but for the sake of time, I'm going to be giving you as much context as I can in about 45 minutes. And as Dr. Moore said, wait for the end before we have questions and comments, and Dr. Moore will bring you the microphone. So what I'm about to talk about is a deeply controversial subject that often invokes passionate disagreement between the sides. I'm asking for everyone to keep an open mind and be respectful of others. And to that end, I think that this quote from Amos Oz, who an Israeli author and critic, is a really good one. This is the history of persecuted peoples, both sides, and that makes it a very complex and difficult subject to learn about and to talk about. It's also a subject that Americans really don't know very much about, so I'm delighted to see so many people here today to learn more about it. But it is a history that is real and deeply painful for a lot of people, most importantly, Palestinians and Israelis. And I think it's important for me to tell you that personally, I have a lot of people that I care deeply about who are on both sides of this conflict. I met a lot of people living and working in Jerusalem and visiting the West Bank. regularly during those research trips. I've taken Eastern students to Israel, to the West Bank, to visit Palestinian refugee camps, to visit the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And all of my time spent there meeting people, talking to people, I've learned two really, really, really important lessons. And the first one is intellectual humility. This is a very hard topic. It's very complex. And there's so much that I don't know. And I've learned over the years that I will never be able to understand all aspects of this conflict. And the second lesson that I've learned is that I have respect for the complexity of the situation. When I was working at a research institute in Jerusalem, the director of the institute told me a really, I think, important story to illustrate this point. He says, when people arrive in the region, they can write volumes and volumes on solutions to the conflict, right off the bat, right? They know what to do. The longer you stay, the less you can write until you've spent a significant amount of time in the region, and then you can barely write a paragraph. I think that's a really good way to think about the complexity and the intellectual humility that we need to have when we study this. History is real and alive in this part of the world in a way that we Americans don't fully understand. History is heritage, history is a claim, history is motivation. I had the opportunity during one of my fellowships to interview an imprisoned Palestinian who was accused of being a would-be suicide bomber. And the rules of that interview were that I could not tell him my name or what I taught, where I lived, but I could say that I was an educator. So in speaking with him, I said, what would you like Americans to know about the conflict? And he said to me, quote, tell them to learn history. On the other side, there's a long-running joke that every Israeli is an amateur archaeologist and historian because history is meaningful and real and vital for Israelis as well, right? And we have an expression in the US, when we say something is ancient history, it's dismissive, right? Like, that's ancient history. That happened a long time ago. It's not relevant. But for our story, the Arab-Israeli conflict is rooted in ancient history, and of course, it really matters. So I'm going to start with some ancient history, and then I'm going to end with what happened starting on October 7th. So this is a roller coaster ride. A lot of history in a very short amount of time. So the Jewish people trace their lineage to the patriarch Abraham. You've probably heard of this before. Abraham had two sons. One was by his wife's slave, Hagar. His name was Ishmael, and the other was by his wife Sarah, and his name was Isaac. Interestingly, both Jews and Muslims claim Abraham as the original patriarch. It's going to get complicated. This is the first of the complications. The ancient 12 tribes of Israel, which is what I have here on the screen, came from the 12 sons of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac. If any of you have read the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Where you come from, your patriarch, your lineage is very, very important. And it's from the 12 sons of Jacob that we have the 12 tribes of Israel that will eventually come to make the Israelite nation. Probably know this as well. According to the Bible, Moses leads his people away from captivity in Egypt and eventually brings them to the promised land, promised to the Jewish people by God according to the Hebrew Bible. It's known as Canaan at the time. It's also known as Palestine at the time, ancient Palestine. There will be a lot of really famous rulers. Obviously, King David might be the most famous. His son Solomon, also pretty famous, who built a very spectacular temple that's going to be important in our story a little bit later on. But eventually, political infighting among the 12 tribes breaks Israel up into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is Israel, the southern kingdom is Judah. They fight against each other, and then eventually they fight against invaders that come. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, armies of Alexander the Great, all conquered the region in succession, and finally, of course, the armies of Rome appeared as well. And it's worth pointing out on this map, you're going to see a very interesting word there, Philistines. This is, most people think, the early ancestors of the Palestinian people today. And it's really interesting to note where that is on a map. If you've been looking at a map of the conflict, you will see that that is present-day Gaza. So eventually, when the Roman Empire takes over the region, the Jews who live there are often in rebellion. They want independence. They do not want to be subject to the Roman Empire. They're often fighting against the Roman Empire, and in 136 CE, the Roman emperor, after another one of the Jewish rebellions breaks out, decides to rename the whole region Syria Palestinia as an insult to the Jews because those are their historic enemies in ancient history. It's a punishment for rebellion. They get punished again in Jerusalem in 70 AD, where the Roman Empire, getting tired of these rebellions, tears down Solomon's temple and mainly kicks most of the Jews out of Palestine. This is the beginning of what we call the Jewish Diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews around the world after the destruction of their temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. A small contingent will remain up until the present in Jerusalem, living mainly in the old Jewish quarter of the Old City. But most of the Jews are dispersed around the world as a result of that. The Temple Mount, where the temple used to stand, will eventually have a mosque built upon it that will be considered the third holiest site of all of Islam. It is the holiest site for all of Judaism, and Christianity likes it too. So you're talking about a very contested real estate space. One small area, all three monotheistic religions in the world claim Jerusalem as holy, which is why it's often called the Holy Land. That's a reference to three religions. So despite the expulsion from the ancient, I forgot to show you this too. This is what it looked like at the time of Jesus, just to give you a sense of all the different conquering armies that lived there. But despite being expelled from Jerusalem, beginning the Jewish diaspora, Jews retained a very, very close connection to this land. A common greeting and a common farewell among Jews is next year in Jerusalem. And what that meant was that one day we will be back. And that greeting and that salutation has continued on in Jewish tradition. There's also another story that sort of illustrates this very close connection to the ancient homeland. It's a story that was told about a Jewish father and son living in Brazil, and they were reciting a traditional Jewish prayer that calls for rain for Jerusalem. And the little boy asked his dad, "Dad, it's pouring outside. Why are we praying for rain?" And the father said, "That's not our rain. Our rain is in Jerusalem." All this is to say that connection remained an important part of Jewish identity despite the expulsion. Next up, in controlling empires, is the Ottoman Empire. This is a big one. It takes over Palestine, and it rules the region for about 400 years. By the time it collapses in the middle/end of World War I, it's not on good standing. Obviously, the war is going to end the Ottoman Empire. But before that happened, the Ottomans realized that they needed to implement some reforms to try to keep from collapsing. So they imposed 2 land reform laws in the 1800s. And this is really, really important for our story because they changed the way the land worked. Prior to the land reform laws, most Palestinians were peasants who worked the land in sort of a serfdom kind of situation. The Ottomans need to sell public land to raise revenue, so they offer the Palestinian peasants the opportunity to buy the land. But if you buy the land, you have to do 2 things. You have to pay very high property taxes, something we're familiar with in Connecticut, right? But much more seriously, you have to register for conscription into the Ottoman military. So for a lot of peasants who weren't interested in being conscripted into the Ottoman Empire's military and or wanted to not buy the land, couldn't afford the land, what happened as a result of these land reform laws is that the Ottoman Empire sold off huge holdings of land to very, very wealthy urban Arab families. So a big chunk of the land in Palestine is owned by a few people who don't live there. They're absentee landlords. And for the most part, they allow the peasants to remain on the land and do what they've always done. But I have to emphasize this will end up being disastrous for the Palestinian people. So we have absentee landlords who are allowing the Palestinians to remain. At the same time that this is happening, pogroms have broken out in Russia and in Eastern Europe. And a pogrom is a government-sponsored violence, mob violence against Jews. In Russia and in parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were ghettoized. They were not allowed to be a part of the regular community. So when these pogroms broke out, the villages, the ghettos would be ransacked, mass rape, mass murder, pillaging. It's becoming so acute that Jews are desperate to leave Russia and to leave Eastern Europe. A lot of them come to the United States in what we call our second wave of immigration, but a small group go to Palestine. When they arrive, they buy the land from the absentee landlords, sold at very high exorbitant prices. They buy it, fair and square land deal, and for the Palestinians who live on the land, it doesn't really affect them at first, because those first Jewish immigrants into Palestine are happy to let the status quo remain. They're happy not to be in Eastern Europe or Russia anymore. But by the end of the 19th century, a very, very different kind of immigration is about to take place. So Theodor Herzl was a Jewish Austrian journalist who was in 1894, was asked by the newspaper that he worked for to go to Paris to cover what was called the trial of the century. And this was the trial of a French military official who was on trial accused of treason. As it turns out, it had nothing to do with treason. It had everything to do with the fact that Alfred Dreyfus was a Jew. And Theodor Herzl's in the streets of Paris, and he's watching crowds screaming, "Death to the Jews." And this is alarming to him. He is a secular Jew. He is assimilated into Western European society. He never really thought very much about his Jewishness. But then he sees these crowds, and this is the heart of the Enlightenment, right? Enlightenment Europe. And of course, the French Revolution. And if this country that's supposed to be enlightened is screaming death to the Jews, he thinks we might be in trouble, right? So he begins to join with other European Jews who are beginning to think about it's time to form a homeland, to form a state. And in 1896, he publishes his manifesto, The Jewish State. And I have the words up here because they're super important. The world needs the Jewish state. Therefore, it will arise. Am I ahead of time? Are the sufferings of the Jews not yet acute enough? We shall see. 1896. All right. He also establishes the World Zionist Organization, the purpose of which is to lobby internationally to get legal and official endorsement of the creation of a Jewish state from European leaders. And he says this about the goal. Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized and legally secure home in Palestine. Publicly recognized, legally secured. So they begin to lobby the governments of Europe to make that happen. As it turns out, World War I is going to make that happen. Because even before the war had ended, Lord Balfour of the British government issued a very famous statement called the Balfour Declaration that offered official British support for this plan. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That's a very short sentence that causes a whole lot of problems. It's also, I think, arrogance on the part of the British that they think all of this can happen. Nobody's going to lose out, right? But for Herzl and the World Zionist Organization, this is what they've been looking for. So when the war ends, the British and the French carve up the Middle East. The truth of the matter is they were planning on doing that before the war even ended. So the British are given control of Palestine through the League of Nations mandate, which is a fancy word for imperialism. And when that happens, now this can happen for the Jewish people. So immediately the World Zionist Organization starts working. This is their opportunity to plan a state. And so a whole different group of immigrants come to Palestine with the purpose of preparing for statehood, right? They're going to build hospitals, schools, infrastructure. They're well funded by other Jewish charity organizations, so they come to Palestine with money, right? Where do they get the land? They buy it from the Arab absentee landowners. Perfectly legal property sales at exorbitant prices, but completely legal, right? This is why this gets complex. But unlike the first group, they want to do all the work themselves. That's the point of a Jewish state, a place where Jews are self-sufficient, protect themselves. And so what that means for the Palestinian peasants who are living on the land is that they get expelled. So we see where the trouble is going to start, right? The status quo is dramatically disrupted at that point. It was also hard for the Palestinian peasants who were undersupported and underfunded by their fellow Arabs, watching these well-funded new immigrants come in and build a state. And it certainly didn't help the matter that the World Zionist Organization advertised coming to Palestine by saying it's a land without a people for a people without a land. Right? That's going to be an issue later on. There are people in that land, of course. And not really surprising, as the number of immigrants increased, more and more tension results. People are getting expelled from their land. The Jews are saying, we bought this land, it belongs to us, which is absolutely legally true. But violence breaks out over the next couple of decades. Riots, the Palestinians attack the Jews attack the Palestinians, and both groups attack the British, which the British don't care for. They are in the middle of it. I mean, it's kind of their fault, really, but they're in the middle of it, right? And they're getting attacked by Palestinians, they're getting attacked by Jews. A Jewish terrorist organization called the Irgun blows up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which is the headquarters of the British imperial government there. It's getting really violent really fast. So the British do what they always do. They order reports and commissions and think about policy. Nothing works. Nothing works. So finally, on the eve of the Second World War, they say no more Jewish immigration, which the Jews feel like is an abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. The Palestinians, of course, are happy to hear that. But this is some seriously bad timing for the Jewish people. World War II begins, and we have to think about what Herzl's comment was. Are the suffering of Jews not acute enough? By the end of the war, 2/3 of the European Jewish population has been murdered, approximately 6 million people. Those who survive the Holocaust are homeless, stateless. Some try to go back to their homes and are murdered. So the British and the Americans establish a commission, because that's what we like to do. And it traveled all over the displaced people's camps in Europe to talk to people who were survivors of the Holocaust, asked them what they wanted to do, went to the Middle East, talked to people there, went to Palestine, talked to people there. And in polling the survivors of the Holocaust, they asked, where do you want to go? 98% said Palestine. 1.5% said the United States, and Britain got 0.5, right? So you have an overwhelming desire from Holocaust survivors to go to Palestine. So the British have had enough. They're not happy about the fact that the survivors want to go to Palestine because it was already violent before World War II broke up. So they say, we're out, we're done. Brand new UN, you figure it out. So they try, to their credit. In 1947, they come up with a partition plan for the region. Take a look at that map. Those are some wonky borders right there. They were designed around where the largest populations of each side were. The Palestinians 100% reject the plan. No, absolutely not. This is our land. You don't have the right to divide it. The Jews grudgingly accept it. It's not what they wanted, but it beats not having a state at all. But in the meantime, a civil war breaks out because everybody knows the British are going to leave, and everybody knows boots on the ground are going to determine the final borders. So even before Great Britain leaves on May 14th, 1948, the war has already begun. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion and the Provisional Government announced the birth of the modern state of Israel, and immediately it is attacked by all the surrounding armies of the Arab nations, who have decided that they are going to have to wipe out this catastrophe, or al-Nakba, before it gets off the ground. The first Secretary General of the newly formed Arab League said this, and I quote, This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongol massacres and their crusades. So the Israelis know what they're fighting for, and the Palestinians know what they're fighting for. But it was a lopsided war by every account. The Israelis put everything they had into this war, 90,000 people. The Arab armies only came up with 45,000 people. And Israel was ready, they were training, they were well supplied, and the Arab armies really seriously underestimated that and undercommitted to the effort. As a result of the war, Israel has a lot more territory than the UN had assigned it in 1945. And you also have a massive displacement of the Palestinian people who were fleeing the war, as people tend to do, but once they left, they were not allowed back to their homes. And in the meantime, what you see is sort of that green area that's east of Jordan. It's called actually it's east of Israel. It's called the West Bank because it's west of Jordan. And this purple strip that's the sort of the issue we're going to be talking about today. There was no land left for the Palestinians. Jordan claimed the West Bank. Egypt claimed the Gaza Strip. Literally, there's nothing left for the Palestinians. What's really important to understand is Egypt took Gaza, not intending to give it back to the Palestinians, and Jordan took the West Bank. In fact, Jordan annexes the West Bank and makes it a part of the kingdom in 1950. So it becomes very clear to the Palestinians right away that they are on their own. They're not going to be truly helped by their Arab neighbors, which leads me to the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 60s. Their goal was to liberate the Palestinian territories through armed struggle. And a few years after its establishment, Yasser Arafat will become its spokesperson and chairman. This is a picture of Yasser Arafat addressing the United Nations, in which he gives a very famous speech. He says, "I have the olive branch in one hand, I have the gun in the other. Don't make me drop the olive branch." And he becomes a focus of interest for the Middle East, but also, as you can see, his depiction on the cover of Time magazine, Americans find him to be an interesting figure as well. Over time, the Palestinians will view the PLO and Arafat as the only organization and spokesperson that they recognize. Meanwhile, none of Israel's neighbors have recognized its right to exist, which results obviously in instability. Constant border skirmishes. There's even a war between Egypt, Israel, France, and Great Britain over the rights to use the Suez Canal. The war ends, the UN peacekeeping forces are assigned to guard the borders of the Suez Canal to keep everybody on their best behavior. But tensions are continuing for sure. In 1967, the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, is being pressured into doing something finally for the Palestinians. And he begins to plan for a war to take out Israel once and for all. He forms military alliances with Jordan and with Syria. He begins to saber rattle. He begins to talk about pushing the Jews into the sea. And he orders the UN peacekeeping forces to leave the area, which they do. Very interesting choice by the UN there. Israel doesn't want to wait for the war to start, so on June 6th, they preemptively attack the militaries of Egypt and eventually Jordan and Syria, and in 6 days, take a lot of territory. 6 days. The Israelis capture the entire Sinai Peninsula, including Gaza. They capture the West Bank. They unite Jerusalem under Israeli control, and they take the Golan Heights. 6 days. The result of this is catastrophic for Middle Eastern leaders. Number one, their militaries are gone. But number two, they are seen as failures as leaders. They are secular. And this is the moment where militant Islam will take its foothold. If you can't get it done secularly, maybe religion is the answer here. But it also created, once again, massive Palestinian displacement. And now, all Palestinians are under total occupation by Israel. So the UN, trying to fix it, publishes Resolution 242, which basically says 2 things need to happen for peace to be restored. Number one, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the territories occupied in the recent conflict. Number 1.1, termination of all claims or states of belligerency in respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force. Sounds good, right? But here's what goes wrong. The Arab countries say, you have to withdraw before we consider recognizing you. And Israel says, no, you have to recognize you, and then we withdraw. Chicken egg, nothing happens. When Israel occupied these territories, at first it had no intention of keeping them apart from Jerusalem, which East Jerusalem had been under Jordanian control, West Jerusalem had been under Israeli control. The Israelis united. They're not planning on leaving. But when it came to the other territories, at first Israel was holding them as bargaining chips. In other words, we're leaving them here. Once you start recognizing our right to exist, you can have them back. But the Arab League said no to recognition, no to negotiation. As a result of that, time passes. And the right-wing Israelis who believe that all of the land is their biblical inheritance use this opportunity to start spreading into the Palestinian territories and setting up settlements. This happens gradually. At first, there are no settlements, and then the settlements begin in Palestinian territory. So Egypt really, really, really wants the Sinai back. So their new leader, Anwar Sadat, starts a war, surprise attack on Israel in October of 1973. He doesn't think he's going to beat Israel. He doesn't, but it looks like a military victory for the Arabs for the first couple of weeks, which they take as a victory. But most importantly, what he's trying to do is to get Israel to negotiate with him to get back the Sinai. Ultimately, that begins to happen after Americans get involved to try to settle the war and begin to have negotiations between the Egyptians and the Israelis that eventually lead in 1979 to the Camp David Accords. It's a really interesting story. Anwar Sadat started it. He actually said to Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, hey, I'd like to come visit you. How can you visit a country that doesn't exist? It was a really big deal. But the start is really slow, so Jimmy Carter, our president at the time, gets involved, and he invites both parties to come to Camp David, the compound in Maryland, the presidential compound, to try to figure out some kind of peace agreement. And these pictures really cracked me up, because if you looked at those pictures, you'd be like, man, they're all getting along? It's fantastic. No, this was for the reporters. It got so bad that the Israelis threatened to leave, and Jimmy Carter went and stole their bags so they couldn't leave the compound, right? Begging both of these people to please, let's get something done. Jimmy Carter drops the F-bomb several times in these negotiations, which tells you how tricky and frustrating they were. But eventually, a peace agreement is hammered out between Egypt and Israel. In exchange for recognition, Israel will eventually give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. But guess who gets left out entirely out of those negotiations? Palestinians. That's a record. It's a pattern. Meanwhile, for Palestinians who are in the other occupied territories, life is getting increasingly more difficult. They are occupied, but they don't have any representation in government. They don't have a state. They're stateless. It's difficult working in Israel, living in the territories. Things are getting really, really rough. And of course, the fact that Israel is increasing the settlements into Palestinian territories is sparking more and more violence and reaction to what's happening. Finally, in 1987, the Palestinians launched their first intifada, or uprising, against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. This is a very, very interesting event because it was spontaneous. It just happened. It wasn't orchestrated by leaders. It was the people themselves. And it was largely on the part of Palestinians nonviolent. Boycotts, civil disobedience, right? Clearly invoking the legacy over and over again in primary sources of Martin Luther King Jr. as being an inspiration. Yes, there was violence, but on the whole, it wasn't very violent. Unfortunately, the Israeli response to it was highly violent. The use of lethal force meant that unarmed Palestinians were killed in the thousands. And it got so bad that an Israeli human rights organization called for the end of the Israeli lethal force response to the Intifada. The United States condemned Israel. The European Union condemned Israel. But it did lead to something really important. It lasted 5 years. And almost by the end of it, the Madrid conference begins. And this was an attempt to get everybody back to the negotiating table, Arab leaders, Palestinians, Israelis, to try to figure out once and for all what can be done to create statehood for the Palestinians in their territories. It's a fiasco, the Madrid conference. Reporters are there, so everyone's posturing, and they're all saying inflammatory things. Even the shape of the table in the negotiation room is a source of discontent. Should it be a circle? Maybe that's more equitable. Should it be rectangle? No. Who's going to be on the front end and the back end of the table? Is an oblong table too much like a rectangle? This is, seriously, lots of time and energy spent on what the table looked like. It's a disaster. Nothing is accomplished. Meanwhile, the Norwegians are watching what's going on, and they think, you know what, we could get involved. We can quietly and secretly bring the Israelis and the Palestinians to Oslo, and away from the media and away from all the noise, sit down and figure it out. And they do, sort of. The Oslo Accords, 1 and 2, are a result of the secret meeting held in Oslo, Norway. The first one, Oslo 1, 1993, is known as the Declaration of Principles. It was signed by Israeli Prime Minister Rabin and, of course, Arafat for the Palestinians. Basically, what it did was set a timetable for the eventual statehood of Palestine. It was very, very, very complex. You can see from this map, I'm not even going to try to explain what this means, but you should know it's super complex. What is that going to look like? Where are the Israeli settlements? Where are the Palestinian villages? How do we create a state from these areas? The second, Oslo 2, is signed in 1995. And in this declaration, Yasser Arafat renounces terrorism and his dedication to the destruction of Israel, recognizes Israel, and in exchange, independent government begins in Gaza. Everybody's really, really excited, right? This is it. The thing has happened. We're going to make it happen. It doesn't, spoiler alert. Years drag on, and there's renegotiation, and there's violence, and there's more settlements, and there's counter-violence, to the point now that I think we can safely say Oslo 2 is dead. Oh yeah, here's the... Clinton was happy, though, to take credit for Oslo, as you can see in this photograph where he looks happy that everyone signing this agreement is going to be great. It's not. In 2000, nothing has really happened. So Clinton goes for it again, and he invites Arafat and Ehud Barak at that point to Camp David, where the first magic had happened, thinking, oh, if we get back to the spot, something good's going to happen. Magic did not strike twice. Nothing happens. And in the meantime, the second intifada in Gaza and the West Bank begins, and it is far more violent than the first intifada was, to the point that suicide bombers are coming into Israel, so much that 1,000 Israelis are killed by suicide bombers, cafes, nightclubs, buses, supermarkets. So Israel responds by building a massive wall that separates the West Bank from the rest of Israel. Interestingly, it does stop the suicide bombings, but it creates a whole other host of problems, because life gets even more difficult in the West Bank for Palestinians there. And I have a couple of pictures of Banksy. The walls have become sort of a protest art thing. Very, very interesting. A lot of the graffiti is in English. It's obviously intended for a Western audience. I've taken students to see some of this part of the wall to see what it looks like in real life. It does stop the suicide bombing. It makes things worse for Palestinians. At the end of the Second Intifada, though, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Completely withdraws from Gaza. Gaza returns to Palestinian control. Of course, Israel controls the border, its seaports, and its airspace, but Gaza is returned to the people who live there. In 2006, the first democratic elections that have ever been held were held. Hamas is elected democratically. Hamas is a militant Islamic organization That's charter is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. It's also a social organization that provided a lot of social services that people needed. So they win the election. The following year, they overthrow their secular counterpoints, which is the Fatah, secular political party, and we have not had elections since. There have been no democratic elections in Gaza since 2006, which I think is really important because we don't really know what the people of Gaza think about their leadership because they're not allowing for any elections to take place. Since Hamas took over Gaza, there have been 4 wars with Israel that have left thousands and thousands of people dead. Hamas has been labeled as a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and Great Britain, particularly because they tend to use humans as shields. So they have integrated their military infrastructure into Gaza under mosques, under hospitals, under schools, which means, of course, if they're attacked, civilians will die. And this is obviously a violation of international law. I'll explain why they do that in just a second. Yeah. I'm going to do that right now. So this is an interesting slide because we're going to talk about what happened on the 7th very quickly because we're running out of time. I just want you to see size comparison of the area of Gaza that we are talking about here, right? Gaza is 147 square miles. It's like 6 miles wide at its narrowest point. That's very, very small. It has an incredibly dense population. It's one of the poorest parts of the world, high density population, no economic resources. It mainly subsists on charity or United Nations funds. The West Bank is about 2,000 square miles with 3.3 million people. And just for comparison's sakes, here's Delaware, our little estate. It's bigger than both. The point of showing you this is that this is a very small region, highly populated and very condensed. So that brings us to what happened on the 7th of October when, in what is being called Operation Al-Aqsa Storm, Hamas sent about 1,000 fighters into Israel during the Simchat Torah holy holiday. As you know what happened, I'm not going to belabor the massacres of civilians and of other people, including Americans, but approximately 1,500, and the number's changing, Israelis were massacred, and approximately 250 Israelis were taken hostage. Israel's response was not surprising to anyone who knows Israel. They have an open policy of what they call disproportionate response. If you hit me hard, I'm going to hit you harder so you don't do it again. And of course, they responded immediately with full force, right? We knew that they would do that. But at this point, Israel is angry, it's hurting, scared, a lot like us on 9/11. In some ways, this is their 9/11. They're emotional about what's happened, understandably. They're heartbroken, but anger is not a strategy, right? So their retaliatory response to Gaza has now become, as they intended it to be, disproportional. To bring it up to the present moment, as you know, Israel has ordered the evacuation of all civilians in northern Gaza, which is about 1.1 million people, to go to the south within 24, 48 hours, which is actually impossible. The infrastructure has been bombed to the point that they cannot flee. And I'd like to point out that Egypt is not opening its borders to anyone in Gaza. Right now, the goal is to get a humanitarian corridor open so that you can get supplies into into Gaza, because Israel has imposed a total blockade. No water, no fuel, no medicine, nothing, until the hostages are released. The international community is saying you might need to get some supplies in there before what's already a humanitarian disaster becomes a disaster of epic proportions. Right? But Hamas is threatening to execute live the hostages it has right now unless Israel stops its attack on Gaza. So this is very, very serious for the region. Obviously, it's very serious for everyone who lives in Gaza, right? It's also serious because of its ability to escalate into a much, much larger conflict. We're already seeing Hezbollah, which is a Shia Muslim militant organization, firing rockets into northern Israel. And last I checked, about 200,000 Israeli soldiers are being sent to the north to protect it. You also have what appears by all accounts to be preparation for a land invasion of Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. I want to talk about that for a second. Mark Lynch in Foreign Affairs had a really good point about what can go disastrously wrong with that invasion. Even if Israel does succeed in toppling Hamas, it will then be faced with the challenge of governing the territory it abandoned in 2005 and then mercilessly blockaded and bombed in the intervening years. Gaza's young population will not welcome the IDF as liberators. There will be no flowers and candy on offer. Israel's best case scenario is a protracted counterinsurgency in a uniquely hostile environment where it has a history of failure and in which people have nothing left to lose. So what Israel's going to do, we don't know. I will say this, and then I'll open it up for questions. I think very quietly, a lot of pressure is being put on Israel to not do a land invasion of Gaza. Openly, the United States is not being critical of Israel, but privately, there is a lot of pressure on the Israeli government to rethink the idea that an invasion into Gaza will go well for them, because history tells us that rarely works out well. You have street by street fighting, insurgencies in the cities. Civilians are definitely going to be killed in high numbers. Israel wants to be able to protect itself. That's an understandable thing, but there aren't any really obviously easy solutions. Again, this is the question of the complexity of the conflict and intellectual humility. We hope that Iran does not get involved, because that would be really bad, really, really bad. We're trying to keep everybody calm and try to talk Israel out of a land invasion. I don't know if that will be successful. So I had more to say, but we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that I have time for student questions first. So Dr. Moore will man the microphone for us.
Please be patient as I climb up and down the narrow stairs. Any questions?
You mentioned there was a reason for Hamas building under infrastructure like hospitals and schools. Is this simply because it's really cramped, or is there more to it?
It's both, right? Because anytime Israel responds, it's likely civilians will be killed, which is bad press for Israel. But it's also, as you saw with the Delaware comparison, so densely packed as it is. Yep. And I think that, and I should have said this because I forgot, I was rushing. I'm pretty sure Hamas wanted this response from Israel. What else were they thinking? They weren't going to defeat Israel with their 1,000 fighters incurring into Israel. They want that disproportionate response. Why? Because the world will focus on Gaza again. Yep.
So I know that you're an expert on American foreign policy in the Middle East. Do you believe that it is possible that, similarly to Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, that America could seek involvement in the conflict that is currently growing in between Israel and Palestine?
Not militarily. I don't think we are looking at American military response or American soldiers fighting in this conflict, but we are deeply involved in it, and we have been from the very beginning. We're pretty much the only country that can put any kind of pressure on Israel, right? We're tight allies. They don't really listen to other people. Maybe they will listen to the U.S. So the U.S. is diplomatically deeply involved. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, has been flying all over the place, trying to keep everybody from letting this war spill into a regional conflict. So we're involved heavily diplomatically, but we are not, I don't think, I'd be really shocked if we become involved militarily.
You mentioned that originally Israel did not want to annex the West Bank or Gaza. Do you think that if Israel forces Palestinians to evacuate northern Gaza, that'll be a similar situation where Israel will not leave, but it also won't officially annex it?
Yes, that is what foreign policy experts are thinking about, because Gazans don't want to get caught up in the war, obviously, but they also have the memory of what happened in 1948, right? So how do you make sure that Israel doesn't come back in and reoccupy Gaza, especially because they want to try to eliminate Hamas altogether? And there's been discussions about whether or not the UN or some sort of international agency can go in, protect Gaza while other issues are being figured out. I don't know what's going to happen there, but certainly the memory of 1948 is strong.
Sorry, I'm very loud, so I won't have to use this. But can you talk about the conditions of Palestinians within like small slums, and what do they have to deal with like on a daily basis being inside of them?
Yes, good question. I think I mentioned that Gaza, even before this happened, was a humanitarian crisis, right? It has no real economy. Its borders are patrolled by Israel, airspace patrolled by Israel. So it's a poverty-racked area. The West Bank also, but not quite to the degree of Gaza, simply because it's a very small space with a very heavy population. So life is very tough, very tough. There's no real economy. It's all based on international aid donations, for the most part. Yep.
From what I've seen online, part of this overreaction from Hamas is due to the fact that there has been Israeli politicians visiting Al-Aqsa, and there have been multiple crackdowns in Al-Aqsa.
Yeah.
Also, on top of that, there have been Israeli settlers moving to the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But why is it that Israeli settlers continue to like move in these areas where they know it's going to purposely offend Palestinians
Yep.
and force some kind of an overreaction from them?
Excellent question. So when we talk about Israeli society, we have to be mindful that now more than ever, it's a highly divided country, much like we are in the United States. You have Israelis on the left who don't believe in the settlements, and even more interestingly, the IDF resents the settlers because they are charged with protecting them, and often they're given military exemptions, so they don't even have to serve in the military. So half of Israel completely rejects the idea of settlement. But the right wing under Netanyahu claims that biblical heritage of Judea and Samaria. So they're saying we have a right to this land because of ancient history, right? So of course it's provocative. There's no doubt about it. The settlements are provocative. But Israel is a very torn society right now. And that kind of reminds me, I wanted to say something about the people who were killed in Israel were living in kibbutzes, which is definitely left wing, pro-peace, working hard for dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis, and they were the ones who were slaughtered. So this is affecting everyone, whether you're left wing, right wing, but certainly I would not disagree that the settlements are provocative. Absolutely.
Why wait till today? Why wait till now to start something like this? Was it an effect of surprise? Was it something that was happening for, like, I know that how we got here, but why now? Like, why is this happening right now?
So that's a good question that no one's entirely sure about. The name of the operation was Operation Al-Aqsa, which is a reference to the violence that had been happening at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, right? Why it happened now, I'm not sure. It was definitely an intelligence failure. The Egyptians warned the Israelis that something big was going to happen 3 days before the attack. But we don't know exactly why they chose this moment. There are a lot of theories. Was it a reference to the 1973 war, which also began in October and also started on a Jewish holiday? Not sure about why this moment. Oh, wait, I just remembered. There's a lot of talk of Middle Eastern nations beginning to recognize Israel. You had a round of that with the Abraham Accords, and word on the street was that Saudi Arabia was considering recognition, right? Now, with what's happening in Gaza, that's probably off the table, which certainly is a benefit for Hamas. Yep.
So recently, we sent $100 million in humanitarian assistance to Gaza, but we sent billions and billions to Ukraine. Could you speak on why that is such a big disparity?
Well, this is a pretty new war, right? The Ukraine war has been going on for over a year, and we're focused obviously in Western Europe, but we give a lot of money to the Palestinian territories. We also, I think Israel is like either the #1 or the #2 recipient of US foreign aid dollars. It's Egypt, Israel, Egypt. I'm not sure which one is #1.
I just wanted to ask why Egypt is not like opening its borders to the Palestinians.
That's a great question. It's a consistent pattern in this history. of Palestinians being neglected by other Arab countries. I think Egypt is worried about the chaos of inviting the refugees into Egypt, but they haven't announced why they're not going to open their borders to Gazan refugees. Yeah, good question. I don't know.
So you had discussed with this quote about how they were thinking about invading Gaza and like what would happen if the invasion was successful. What do you think would happen if the Israelis failed in their invasion of Gaza? What would follow after that?
Great question, Jason. The story keeps changing daily, right? I mean, today, Biden is in Israel, right? I mean, there's a lot happening and a lot happening very quickly. This is why it's a complex situation. I personally don't think an invasion of Gaza would be a military success at all. I think it'll be a disaster. So then you're left with the question of what do you do then, right? And I just don't have an answer for that. But it's a good question.
I just have a question. It's like regarding Hamas using Palestinian civilians in Gaza as like human shields. If Israel's aware of Hamas's tactics, why do they continue to bomb these schools and these hospitals and these places where people live? And like, why is it that a lot of Gazan neighborhoods are completely demolished and gone if they are aware that civilian life will be lost?
Yes. So why do they keep doing it? Yeah. They aren't left with a lot of options. How do you destroy Hamas without killing civilians due to the very dense nature of Gaza and the fact that the military infrastructure is under these civilian shields? Again, it's complicated, right? How do you go after a terrorist organization that's invaded you and attacked you without killing civilians, which is why it's a no-win situation for everybody involved, Gazans, Israelis.
What do you think is the best case scenario at the end of this, and what do you think is the worst case scenario to come out of this?
All right, I'm going to be a crazy optimist for a second. I'm normally not when it comes to this conflict, but because what's happened is so dramatic, there is a small chance that Israel will have enough pressure put on it to come up with a peaceful path to statehood for Gaza and the West Bank. It's not going to happen immediately, certainly not. But eventually, with enough pressure, with enough international pressure, we might have a successful Oslo Accords, Oslo 2.0. Worst case scenario, I think we're looking at it right now, massive, massive casualties, particularly Gazan casualties, if a land invasion happens, right? And whether Hamas could be eradicated, I don't know. No one really thinks that that's possible, not without significant, significant destruction.
Hello. So I wanted to ask a question about actually it predates Hamas and the formation of a lot of fundamentalist groups in Gaza and Palestine in the 80s. I heard that a lot of them were actually funded by Israel. A lot of the far-right groups were funded by the Israeli state as a way to counteract against left-wing and communist liberation movements. Could you explain a little bit about that for me? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's been overemphasized, but you're right, there is an element of truth to it because the Israelis did not like Yasser Arafat and Fatah, which was a secular organization. Arafat had dedicated himself to the destruction of Israel, committed all kinds of terrorist acts, so they thought, well, these people must be better, right? And so, in a very small way, supported the political challenging of Fatah. But I wouldn't call them bankrolled by the Israelis. I think we're running out of time. One more question. Okay, we'll do two more, but there's something happening here at 4. I want to be respectful of that.
Sorry, this is like kind of a 2-in-1, but you stated that the Arab neighbors were preventing them from immigrating, which I agree with. But what do you think of Israel telling half of Gaza to evacuate, and then bombing the escape route through Egypt? Isn't that a form of ethnic cleansing? Because otherwise they only get bombed, right?
So I think the order to evacuate is impossible for Gazans to fulfill, which is obviously creating a humanitarian crisis. But I think it's interesting that we're not seeing any other countries that are willing to house these refugees while this war is happening. One more question.
What role does like social media misinformation have in like this current conflict?
That's a great question, to end on, and it allows me to add a note of caution to everyone, because this is being wildly covered in social media with very gruesome, very emotional, very sensational images on both sides of the conflict, and I'm not saying don't pay attention to that, but I am saying that it's a PR war for both sides at this point. And so this is why I had this talk today. I just wanted people to take a beat, think about the conflict in its historical context, so that maybe when you see these social media posts, you have a little bit more information to work with. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming out.